Hi, I'm David Miller, here with the ninth and final mini-lecture in a series on Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. We're going to wind up our series by talking about redemption. We saw last time that as the novel enters its final phase, echoes of the opening scenes start to accumulate. They come thick and fast as the novel moves to its close. Compeyson's death, for example, as he and Magwitch go under the steamer locked in combat, harks back to their earlier struggle on the marsh. Pip's long illness, tended by Jo, not only recalls his own tenderness toward the dying Magwitch in prison, it also returns him to the novel's first chapters. Jo stayed with me, he says, and I fancied I was little Pip again. I was like a child in his hands. This return to the beginning completes the process by which Pip has to recover a sense of Jo's dignity. There was no change whatever in Jo. Exactly what he had been in my eyes then, he was in my eyes still, just as simply faithful and as simply right. Pip's return to childhood is not complete, for there is one part of the past he cannot recover, the companionate marriage he might have had with Biddy. His contrite recognition of her worth comes too late, and he arrives to propose only to find that she has just married Jo. In the epilogue, 11 years later, he comes back from trading in the East to find that he has become a child again, quite literally. There is a new little Pip by the hearth with Jo. In this way, the novel does end with the formation of an ideal nuclear family. The new family looks like a reformed version of the Gargery household we first encountered, with Jo, now free from the rampages of the evil stepmother Biddy has replaced, able to father little Pip in the way he had always wanted to. As for Big Pip, I've said all along that he winds up alone, but it isn't quite that simple. That was the way the novel ended at first, before Dickens was persuaded by a friend to make the ending less bleak. The revised epilogue is deliberately ambiguous. Pip finds Estella, now a widow, walking on the grounds where Satis house once stood. He takes her by the hand, and the novel concludes with another echo from the final lines of Milton's Paradise Lost. You may recall that Dickens had already alluded to this passage at the end of Volume 1. That reference was ironic, for while Milton's Adam and Eve walk out of the garden hand in hand, Pip was leaving home in solitude and sorrow. In a subtle but unmistakable way, this second allusion corrects the first, linking Pip and Estella, sadder but wiser after all they have suffered, with Adam and Eve as they leave the Garden of Eden to begin the first human family after the fall. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. The reference is to Milton, but also by way of Milton, to the Bible. I began our discussions of Dickens by suggesting that the novel's opening scene also contains biblical allusions, first to the binding of Isaac, and then to the crucifixion. You recall that I argued these allusions are so parodic and distorted, they suggest a sense of alienation from the sacred scripture, akin to views put forward by the influential social critic Thomas Carlyle in his masterpiece, Sartor Resartus. Now, in the novel's closing scenes, the Bible, too, makes a return. Dickens approaches the scriptures cautiously at the end, so cautiously that it's easy to miss. In the opening of chapter 17, Pip describes Magwitch in prison, too weak from his injuries to speak much. But, says Pip, he was ever ready to listen to me, and it became the first duty of my life to say to him and read to him what I knew he ought to hear. What Magwitch ought to hear, being near death, is the Gospels, and we're meant to understand that this is what Pip reads to him. There are other hints, as we'll see in a moment. Moments like this show that as the story gathers to its close, with various characters forgiving one another and seeking reconciliation, the novel itself seeks a reconciliation with its sacred prototype. The moment when Magwitch is sentenced to death signals this by returning to the typological mode of symbolism. The sun was striking in at the great windows of the court through the glittering drops of rain upon the glass, and it made a broad shaft of light between the 32 and the judge, linking both together, and perhaps reminding some among the audience how both were passing on with absolute equality to the greater judgment that knoweth all things and cannot err. That broad shaft of light comes straight out of the popular literature of religious reform movements in the early 19th century, where it regularly signals God's providence shining down into the world below, often in deathbed scenes. Here, Dickens is echoing this popular symbolism with no sense of irony, no distortion. In the same way, he echoes the language of the Bible. Knoweth is a dead giveaway, but again, without playfulness or irony. At any other moment, if Dickens were to throw in an archaic phrase like knoweth all things, you know it would be a joke, part of the facetious tone that makes his style amusing. But not here. At this moment, he is seeking the opposite effect, letting the language of the Bible shine through his style like that shaft of sunlight shining through the raindrops on the glass. This reconciliation with the Bible is confirmed at the close of chapter 17, when Magwitch dies in prison. Mindful, then, of what we had read together, I thought of the two men who went up into the temple to pray, and I knew there were no better words that I could say beside his bed than, "O Lord, be merciful to him, a sinner." This is the further hint that I mentioned, letting us know what they were reading together. Once again, the language of the Bible flows into that of the novel. The parable from Luke 18:10-13 tells about a Pharisee and a publican and the different ways in which they pray. The Pharisee boasts, "God, I thank you that I am not as other men are," rejoicing in his superiority. The publican prays in the words Pip quotes, showing that he has been humbled by a sense of failure. "O Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner," he says. The point of the parable, of course, is that the sinner is, ironically, more pure of heart than the righteous man in his pride. I don't think it's much of a stretch to recognize that Pip is identifying with Magwitch at this moment. The Pharisee sets himself apart from the publican. "God, I thank you that I am not as other men are," he says, and continues, "extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican." That had been Pip's response to Magwitch and even to Joe Garge when he was caught in the vicious cycle of shame and pride. When Pip echoes the publican then, it signals that his conversion is complete. His prayer for Magwitch is also a prayer for himself.